Okay, so first I will discuss my lesson plan, what I plan to do with Brigham, and then I will cover any concepts that I wasn't able to discuss in my lesson plan explanation. So first of all, just to kind of put it out there, Brigham is in the industry versus inferiority stage for the Erik Erikson's psychological stages, and that's just based on his age being between 5 to 12 years old. We'll just keep that in mind as we go through the lesson and the terms. So my lesson is on building a blanket fort. And so first, when Brigham comes in, I will have all the materials that he needs out and ready to use and access. And I'll be sure that all the materials that he is able to use are available, and they're all so he doesn't have any questioning of whether he can grab it or whether he can't use it for his fort. So this is an example of physical arrangement. All the materials that he'll have access to, he will be able to have. It's also an example of the physical climate. We will need many of the materials in my apartment, and especially in my living room. So, like I said before, I'll make sure that he knows what he's able to, what he can or cannot use. So, I'm going to begin my lesson by watching a time lapse of a house being built. So we're just going to watch the beginning of the time lapse. It's just basically where they make a flat surface and they start building the walls, and then they go to the roof, and just the progress. And that's just the sole purpose of how a building is structured, just so you can kind of get an idea of what's important to do before you go on to other things for your building when you structure a building. So by showing him this video, this is an example of visualization. And I also will show him, once we get started on the blanket fort, I will also show him an ideal blanket fort, kind of fitting the criteria, which I'll discuss later, that I'm going to give to him. So by showing him this ideal blanket fort, this is also an example of a prototype that I'll be using. I will also have positive and negative instances to this, so that he can kind of see why one works better, one fits a certain criteria, and why one doesn't. And this, by doing this, I'll also be able to access Brigham's personal theory to see what he thinks is most beneficial when creating a blanket fort. So, the case of my prototype, I'll be making sure the blanket is a thinner blanket, and something that's lighter so it doesn't weigh down the fort, but something that is not like a sheet per se, because we want to make sure that the light also stays out of the fort, so it's not too light as well. So in order to do this, we'll have defining features and characteristics of this prototype, and of course I'll have other prototypes as well, but it is important to share defining characteristics when teaching him how to build a fort, because these descriptions will help aid him in creating his fort. So for example, like I mentioned before, a big part of blanket forts is the blankets. So there are many different types of blankets that could be used, and different characteristics that are emphasized, I guess, for the different variety of blankets. So a heavy blanket or a sheet with holes may be less effective than a lighter blanket and a blanket with no holes. So after we watch the video that I was talking about earlier about how a structure is built and the time lapse of it, then I will get an idea of Brigham's personal experiences and be able to access his thoughts on his own personal schema, and also gain a sense of his self-efficacy. So his self-efficacy, so I know that he does have a higher one, because when we pre-assessed them about a month ago, I can tell that he is confident in his blanket fort making skills. So I'm excited to see how that confidence aids him later on. This is also an idea of his self-esteem. So I know that he is confident in doing this, so I hope that he can continue to bring that confidence here when he does come, and hopefully it aids him, and he knows that he is able to do whatever he puts his mind to. And then, yeah, so hopefully he'll be able to do that, but also be able to get out of his comfort zone be able to try new things. So I also know, based on the previous assessments that we did on the kids, that Brigham does not have any type of development or condition that may impede his learning, especially with blanket forts. He seems very eager and excited to learn, and I hope that that'll be more optimal for learning. So that's his individual physical state. So, okay, what I have here is a self-concept. When he begins, I hope his self-esteem and self-efficacy can aid him, asking himself, what am I capable of, or am I able to complete this criteria? Hopefully he'll be able to have a positive self-concept when it comes to our lessons, so that, like I mentioned before, his self-esteem and his confidence can continue to aid him in the process. So many of his theories, conceptions, and ideas will have to do with his own personal experiences and schema. So he could have positive experiences in the past, which would positively transfer into this situation. But even so, if he had negative instances, that will also be able to help him in knowing what he should or should not do this time when creating his blanket fort. Hopefully he also shares these experiences with me, and I'll try to aid him and cue him on doing this, so that he can tell me what went well and what didn't go well in the past. And then this will bring on, again, positive and negative instances. He's going to have his own personal theory, and I will see his personal theory by what he automatically does and what he thinks works best. So, okay, I already talked about positive and negative instances. So, more concepts that I will not know his thoughts until our lesson begins is any misconceptions or overgeneralizations or undergeneralizations that he may have. So as with overgeneralizations and undergeneralizations, I will have to continue to access his prior knowledge and experiences to see if he has any overgeneralizations of things when it comes to creating a blanket fort. An example of this is very general and very most likely won't happen, but an example of an overgeneralization is everything that uses a blanket is a blanket fort. But I'll see, of course, what Brigham has for those three concepts. So after assessing Brigham and after showing him the video comes the fun part. We're going to be building a blanket fort, obviously. So before we begin, I'm going to be giving him a list of criteria of things that he needs to complete and has to have in his blanket fort. So this is no specks of light can come into his blanket fort. 3 people at least have to fit in his fort comfortably. We're not trying to squish in here. He has to have a cool and creative blanket fort name, so I gave that to him before just to kind of loosen things up a bit and get him to prepare something to come. And then the last one is a creative or unique way of being able to get into his blanket fort, something different than just opening up a sheet and be able to walk right in. So I want to see where he kind of goes with those things on the criteria. So later, I'm not going to do this right away, but later, throughout us building the fort, I'm going to tell him that if he completes the criteria, he will receive a favorite treat that I will have pre-planned and also have in my apartment to show him. And this is a form of intrinsic motivation. I'm going to help motivate him by having a prize, creating this blanket fort, and his prize will be one of his favorite treats. So, and then my extrinsic motivation will come from me as an outside source and done by me encouraging him the whole time as we go about making our fort. So stimulus is an event that evokes a specific reaction. So maybe by offering him this treat, it might evoke him to be more keen or motivated to complete this criteria and complete his blanket fort to the best way he can. So the other brain terms I will talk about during my final lesson video. so that I could show specific examples of when Brigham is doing, demonstrating specific terms when it comes to the brain. If I did it now, I'd only be guessing or making an assumption of what he could possibly do. So I want to focus on that more so when it comes to my final lesson and seeing what he does. So as he creates his fort, I will be there, obviously, if he has any questions or if he may need help. But I also want to give him enough space so I'm not hovering over him and aiding to any debilitating anxiety that may occur, and I'll talk about the anxieties later. But I want to give him his own space and practice his, or put in effect on I'm trying to put in effect discovery learning, which I also talk about later. So when assessing Brigham about a month ago, I was not able to assess any apparent trait anxiety that he may have. However, I do not know if any other types of anxiety may become more apparent as our lesson happens. There is a possibility for state anxiety, and that's when a situation or place creates anxiety. And this could be triggered by going to a new place. And I know he's done this before, but it could be triggered by that, or going to a college girls' apartment where there's a bunch of girls, and that state anxiety can trigger debilitating anxiety as well. So I want to be careful on that. And then, as I said, with debilitating anxiety, I hope that this doesn't happen either. But this could happen if it becomes too uncomfortable, especially around other people or my roommates or my friends that are over that he may not know. Debilitating anxiety could also be triggered by an imaginary audience. Even if my roommates aren't home, or even if they are home in the kitchen but they're not even paying attention, he could believe that they're watching him and focus intently on his actions, which could cause debilitating anxiety as well. So if he does have any anxiety, I hope that it will turn into facilitating anxiety, which will improve his performance. So this could be if he wants to improve his performance or do better because other people are watching, he might want to, do better. So I hope to lower any trait or state anxiety by encouraging him with positive feedback and making the environment he is in a comfortable space. When Brigham creates his fort, like I mentioned before, I'll be using one of my favorite forms of instruction, and that's discovery learning. I'll be using this for a huge portion of my lesson. And I want Brigham to discover what works best and what doesn't by himself. Hopefully he can learn from his mistakes and be able to turn those into successes without me hovering over him and telling him what to do and what would work best. So I want him to go through that whole trial and error process. I will try to encourage Brigham to experiment and solve the task of building an effective fort on his own, which will then be out of his own zone of proximal development. So hopefully he uses his own intuition when it comes to this. This could be even when I suggest one item that we could use for our fort, but he goes with his own intuition and uses a different item, and I will be so happy if he does that because that's him going off his own instincts. This could be an example. This could be he would rather use a stack of textbooks instead of clothespins to secure the sheets onto a chair. So my teaching style will also be guided using Bloom's taxonomy. So at the beginning, like I mentioned before, we're gaining knowledge. We are looking at what has happened with previous buildings being built, developing comprehension of the facts and understanding why we have a flat surface, why we build walls before the roof. And then being able to apply these to ourselves. We're building the fort by ourselves and analyzing ideas on how to make a better fort using those positive and negative instances. And then synthesizing and evaluating. So synthesizing kind of is going off what I just spoke about with analyzing, and then evaluating at the end. We're going to evaluate our fort and see if he met the criteria and what makes a good fort prototype. So I will be also using a variation of mastery learning. This is kind of a long shot, but with mastery learning, I'm going to gradually release the criteria for Brigham to accomplish. And so, for example, once he finishes his frame, he'll be able to work on the roof. So that's like the step-by-step that he'll be doing. And once he finishes the roof, he can create a unique door. You can't do the door before the roof necessarily, or before the walls. So it's kind of like that step-by-step process. So I will be using a form of direct instruction, I guess, because I will be teaching him about the different structures and what makes a good building and how to create a good building, and giving him tips. And then I will also be directing the instructional process by guiding what will be taught or done next. So I'm kind of direct instructing him by guiding him throughout my own lesson. When we work together, when he's building his blanket fort, that's an example of cooperative learning. Because there's only two of us, we can't really put into practice the big idea, the big concept of cooperative learning. However, he has me to work with, so I hope that he can also put in effect his own cooperation, and that we can put our brains together and complete our task to a greater extent and a greater success based by working together. So the one type of instruction I will not be using is expository instruction. This means that I will not necessarily be in front of a room lecturing Brigham and making him take notes. However, I will be telling him things he needs to know, but beyond just presenting Brigham with the hard facts. I hope to make it more of a discovery learning method and a discussion more so than him just listening to what I have to say. So when I teach Brigham, and especially when he's creating the blanket fort, I will be using cueing, and this will help guide Brigham throughout his lesson. And these types of cues will be, it can be words, which is the obvious one, vocal words, but it can also be by me even making a sound, or like a validation sound maybe, or like a, I don't know, something like that. Or it could be just based off my own body language, where he can get some cues. However, I don't want to use cues too often, as I do want him to experiment and do things on his own, like I mentioned before. So these cues can be used by information or control language. So information language is an indirect command, and then control is a direct command. And he has a checklist to complete, like I mentioned before, which is an indirect command. He knows that he has to do those. That's me giving him that cue, per se, versus a direct command where I may tell him to go get a blanket or something on those lines. So I will also use constructivism, and I hope to use positive and effective feedback to help guide him to perform to the best of his ability. So one prominent theorist known for his constructivist views is Jean Piaget. I don't know the first name, to be honest. Piaget, though, who focuses on how humans make meaning in relation to the interaction between their experiences and their ideas. So I will also use responses. I know I've mentioned this one before probably too, but asking why he did something or why something worked well. Responding verbally is a great way to make sure that we're on the same page, and just giving him that extra boost of confidence that he may need. And reinforcement goes along with this, and encouragement I hope to use when he may be discouraged or frustrated. And then hopefully this reinforcement that I give will be so positive that contagious behavior can be instigated. And contagious behavior is, let's say, whether the fort's going well or not, I hope to have that positive contagious behavior where I'm staying positive, staying encouraging, so that this will be a similar behavior that he may pick up on or demonstrate himself. And if I become negative or irritated, that behavior that I'm showing him and demonstrating to him, it could have a greater effect on him, and he can begin to develop those same negative or irritated behaviors. So hoping to stay positive, contagious behaviors here. After Brigham has finished his fort, obviously we'll go through the criteria and go through that, which will be really fun. And giving him his chocolate bar or whatever his treat is. If he completed the criteria only, I'm going to stick with that. So that should be fun. We're also going to review what we learned and what he found to be most beneficial, or what aided him the most in the whole process of him building the fort. So this will also work his short-term memory. And hopefully, once we review our lesson at the end, he will be able to remember the building structure video at the beginning, activating that short-term memory to see. But he also may have experiences with the short-term memory on failure to retrieve, and he may not remember something that we discussed before. So I'm going to get an idea of that later on as I assess him at the end and as we review the lesson. We'll also, failure to retrieve, the same kind of idea as failure to store. The same thing could happen depending on if he made any connections to the new information that he learned to make it stick. So hopefully he stored that in a positive way. Maybe I can help him with that at the beginning. So hopefully during my lesson, we don't have any physical interference that could result in pauses or disruption. That could be someone coming to the door, talking, I don't know, or it could be someone just coming in and disrupting the lesson. So hopefully we don't have any interferences by this happening, and I'll try to avoid this by letting my roommates know ahead of time that this lesson will happen. So, and by avoiding any interference, this could also aid in any decay that could be experienced by Brigham if he was unable to remember something due to interference that has happened. So by preventing that interference, we can also prevent decay from happening and failure to remember and failure to store. So that's important. I will also be assessing his attribution theory: internal, external, stable, unstable, controllable, uncontrollable. I'll be assessing all of that as he is doing the whole blanket fort and creating that. So I have to assess that after my lesson with Brigham is over. I will see if there's ever a time where Brigham could have blamed himself for an error that occurred, or if he blamed something else or the blanket. So, and that's likewise for success or achievement. If he says, oh, that was because I did this, or if it was because of, oh, that was a really great pillow. So I'll just kind of get an idea of that later on. And this term kind of goes with attribution theory, but I will see if Brigham has a sense of learned helplessness. If he has an understanding that we are powerless over things we can't control, then that is an example of learned helplessness. So I'll get an idea of that. So overall, there are many types of research that I'll be using during my lesson. So first, descriptive research. What materials work best when blanketing a fort, or when creating a blanket fort. Where are blanket forts best to be created? How to use materials to build a blanket fort, and etc. So hopefully we can ask those questions, those who, what, where, when, how questions to stay descriptive. I hope he'll be able to also not just wait for me to instigate those questions, but he will be prompting himself with his own questions when building his blanket fort. And then the second one is correlational research. Is there a relationship between the materials used and the sturdiness of the structure, or the lack of light or too much light? That's correlational research that we'll also be going through. And the last one is experimental research. And by us performing and experimenting by actually creating the blanket fort, this is an example of this. We're testing the different materials or variables in this case. So just seeing which one works best. That's kind of an example of correlational as well. But, so two other terms I want to quickly discuss that are kind of out of context are assimilation, and so that's when I hope to not have effective assimilating Brigham with my own standards of what fits a good blanket fort, or what it should have, or what it should be. Hope to not assimilate him with any of my own biases, I guess. And then the other term is accommodation. I will give accommodations to Brigham if he needs any. However, I don't think he'll need any accommodations in this lessons, but if it comes up where I see that he may need one, then I can accommodate around that. But anyway, there is my lesson, and like I said before, I will go through those brain terms, especially so once I teach Brigham, and then I could see where he has the specific brain terms during the lesson, I guess. So, alright, so there's my lesson, and I look forward to teaching Brigham this upcoming week. Thank you.